It was 1860. The Atlantic was restless, the wind cutting across the deck like a blade, and somewhere in the middle of that vast ocean, more than 4,000 people were sleeping, eating, and breathing inside a single iron hull. Think about that for a second. 4,000 souls on one ship in 1860. To put that into perspective, the Titanic, 50 years later, carried just over 2,200 passengers. The SS Great Eastern wasn't just big. It was a category that didn't exist yet. A floating city before cities had learned to float. And the moment you stepped aboard, two invisible enemies were already waiting for you. Ones you couldn't see, couldn't smell at first, and couldn't fight with anything the Victorian era had available. One moved through the air. The other hid inside the water you drank every single day. Most passengers had no idea. The crew had no idea. Even the engineers who built her had no idea just how dangerous the solution they had designed would turn out to be. But here is what history textbooks never told you about the greatest ship ever built in the 19th century. The Great Eastern was the brainchild of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, arguably the most ambitious engineer of his generation. The man didn't think in terms of what was possible. He thought in terms of what hadn't been attempted yet. The ship was designed to sail all the way to Australia without stopping to refuel, a concept so radical that most of his contemporaries thought he had lost his mind. To achieve that, the hull had to be massive beyond anything previously imagined, and massive meant one brutal engineering problem that nobody fully solved in time. How do you keep 4,000 people alive when the very systems designed to protect them are slowly killing them instead? Ventilation was the first battlefield. Victorian science understood imperfectly that bad air caused disease. What they called miasma, that vague, invisible cloud of rot and decay, was the dominant theory of illness at the time. Germ theory was still years away from being widely accepted. So when engineers designed the Great Eastern's ventilation system, they were fighting an enemy they couldn't accurately define, using tools built on a theory that was only partially correct. The result was a system that looked impressive on paper, and it failed in ways nobody anticipated. Once the ship was fully loaded with human bodies, burning coal, cooking food, and generating heat in quantities the blueprints had never accounted for. Below deck, the air thickened fast. Passengers in the lower berths described a heaviness that sat on the chest like a wet blanket. The smell was the first warning. By the time it became unbearable, the damage was often already done. But the ventilation problem, as serious as it was, might have been secondary to something far more immediate, far more democratic in who it chose as its victims, and far more invisible in how it operated. The drinking water. Something was wrong with the drinking water, and the answer to what exactly was wrong would reveal one of the most overlooked engineering disasters in Victorian maritime history. The Great Eastern carried water in massive iron tanks built directly into the hull. On paper, the logic was sound. Iron was durable, iron was strong, and iron was exactly the kind of material a Victorian engineer trusted with his life. The tanks were enormous, capable of storing enough water to sustain thousands of passengers across weeks at sea without a single stop for resupply. It was, by any standard of the era, an engineering achievement worth celebrating, and it was quietly poisoning everyone on board. The problem wasn't contamination from outside. It wasn't a leak. It wasn't negligence. And it wasn't the kind of dramatic failure that makes headlines. It was chemistry. Specifically, it was the chemical relationship between iron and water over time. A relationship that Victorian engineers understood far less precisely than they believed. Iron corrodes. When water sits inside an iron tank for days, then weeks, it begins to absorb compounds from the metal itself. The taste changes first. A faint metallic bitterness that passengers initially dismissed as simply the nature of shipboard water. Then the color shifts. A faint reddish tinge that stewards learn to explain away with practiced confidence. And underneath all of it, invisible and entirely undetectable by any Victorian instrument available at the time, bacterial colonies were establishing themselves in the sediment accumulating at the bottom of those tanks. Here is where the story becomes genuinely disturbing. The Great Eastern operated during a period when the connection between contaminated water and diseases like typhoid and cholera was known in theory, but deeply contested in practice. John Snow had already done his famous work on the Broad Street pump in London, just 5 years earlier, in 1854, demonstrating with devastating clarity that cholera traveled through water. But the medical establishment of 1860 had not fully accepted his conclusions. Miasma theory still had powerful defenders, which meant that when passengers aboard the Great Eastern began falling ill with gastrointestinal symptoms, the instinctive explanation pointed upward, toward the air, toward the ventilation problems that were already well documented, toward the smells and the stuffiness and the coal smoke drifting below deck. Nobody was looking down, at the tanks, at the water sitting in corroding iron containers deep in the hull. But here is the detail that changes the entire picture. The ventilation design on the Great Eastern wasn't simply ineffective. In certain sections of the ship, it was actively counterproductive. The system relied on a network of ducts and shafts designed to pull fresh air down from the upper decks and circulate it through the lower berths. In calm weather, with a partial load of passengers, it functioned adequately. But the Great Eastern was never meant to carry a partial load. She was built for capacity, and when that capacity was anywhere near realized, the ventilation shafts became something far more dangerous than useless pipes. They became highways for whatever was already moving through the air below deck, redistributing stale, humid, bacteria-laden atmosphere from one section of the ship to another with mechanical efficiency. Passengers who had chosen berths believing they were in better ventilated areas found themselves breathing air that had already passed through the most crowded sections of the lower hull. The ship was, in this specific and terrible way, more dangerous when full than when empty. And the engineers who designed her had built that danger directly into the blueprint without ever realizing it. But there is a moment in the history of the Great Eastern that almost nobody talks about. And it is the moment that reveals just how deep the problem actually ran. In 1861, during one of her early voyages, a violent storm struck the ship with a force that even her enormous hull could not simply absorb. The Great Eastern was thrown sideways by waves that contemporaries described as mountains of black water. Passengers were hurled across cabins, furniture became projectiles, and the paddle wheels that drove her forward were ripped apart by the force of the ocean. The damage was catastrophic and expensive. But something else happened during that storm that the official reports barely mentioned. The violent motion of the ship disturbed the sediment at the bottom of the water tanks. Everything that had been quietly accumulating over months of operation. The rust particles, the bacterial colonies, the organic matter that had found its way into the iron containers through imperfect sealing. All of it was suddenly suspended in the water supply that thousands of people were drinking. The timing could not have been worse. Passengers were already weakened by seasickness and fear. The ventilation system was performing even more poorly than usual, because the storm had forced every opening on the lower decks to be sealed shut against the water crashing across the hull. The air below deck became almost unbreathable. And into that already compromised environment, the water supply delivered its worst possible version of itself. What followed in the days after the storm was a wave of illness that the ship's medical officers struggled to explain and struggled harder to contain. The Victorian vocabulary for what was happening was limited. They knew people were sick. They knew the numbers were alarming. What they could not do was trace the invisible line connecting the iron tanks, the disturbed sediment, the contaminated water, and the bodies now filling the ship's medical quarters. That line existed with perfect clarity. They simply lacked the scientific framework to see it. But here's what makes this story more than just a historical curiosity about a famous ship. The Great Eastern was not an exception. She was an extreme example of a universal problem that affected nearly every large vessel operating in the mid-19th century. The iron tank water storage system was standard. The inadequate ventilation was standard. The gap between what Victorian engineers believed they understood about air and water and what they actually understood was standard. What the Great Eastern did was concentrate all of those problems into a single hull at a scale that made the consequences impossible to ignore. At least for those paying close attention. Most were not paying close attention. The ship had powerful financial backers, a famous designer whose reputation was essentially untouchable, and a press that had invested enormous enthusiasm in the narrative of British engineering supremacy. Admitting that the greatest ship ever built was slowly making its passengers ill through the very systems designed to keep them safe was not a story that anyone with money or reputation at stake was eager to tell. So it didn't get told. Passengers continued to board. The water continued to sit in its iron tanks. The ventilation shafts continued to redistribute whatever the lower decks were producing. And somewhere in that gap between what was known and what was acknowledged, the real cost of the Great Eastern's design was being paid, quietly, in fever and nausea, and suffering that never made it into the engineering history celebrating her as a triumph of the Victorian age. The most dangerous lies are never the dramatic ones. They are the ones built into blueprints and accepted as solutions. The Great Eastern was eventually retired in 1889, sold for scrap, after a commercial life that never matched the ambitions of the man who designed her. Brunel himself died in 1859, just days after the ship's disastrous maiden voyage, his health already destroyed by the stress of building something the world wasn't ready for. There is a painful symmetry in that. The man and the machine he created both broke under the weight of their own ambition before either one could be properly understood. But the story doesn't end with retirement and scrap metal. It ends with a lesson that took decades to fully absorb, and that the Victorian era never quite managed to apply in time to save the people who needed it most. The turning point came gradually, through the work of people who had nothing to do with ships. Joseph Lister was refining antiseptic techniques through the 1860s. Louis Pasteur was building the scientific foundation of germ theory with experiments that would eventually make miasma theory impossible to defend. John Snow's water contamination work, initially dismissed, was being slowly vindicated by evidence that accumulated faster than the opposition could explain away. By the 1870s and 1880s, the picture was becoming undeniable. Disease didn't travel through bad air. It traveled through specific pathogens, through contaminated water, through the invisible biological world that Victorian engineering had been accidentally cultivating inside iron tanks and recirculating through poorly designed ventilation shafts for decades. When that understanding finally landed with full institutional force, the changes to ship design were rapid and fundamental. Iron water tanks were replaced or lined with materials that didn't corrode and didn't provide surfaces where bacterial colonies could establish themselves. Ventilation systems were completely reconceived, drawing on actual measurements of airflow rather than theoretical calculations made at a drawing board. Medical officers aboard ships were given clearer protocols and, more importantly, a scientific vocabulary that allowed them to identify and respond to outbreaks before they spread through an entire passenger population. The Great Eastern, in a dark and unintentional way, had helped accelerate that process. Not because anyone studied her failures systematically at the time, but because her scale made the consequences visible enough that they eventually could not be rationalized away. She was too big to hide her problems. 4,000 people in one hull meant that when the systems failed, the failure was loud enough to eventually reach ears that were willing to listen. And here is the reflection that stays with you long after the facts have settled. Every era believes its engineering is essentially sound. Every generation of builders trusts the frameworks they were given, applies them with skill and confidence, and produces structures that look like solutions right up until the moment they reveal themselves as something more complicated. The Victorian engineers who designed the Great Eastern were not careless. They were not ignorant in any simple sense. They were working at the absolute frontier of what their civilization understood, and they built something genuinely extraordinary. Something that pushed human capability further than it had ever been pushed on water. They just couldn't see the parts of reality that their framework hadn't been built to detect yet. That is not a Victorian problem. That is a human problem. The question worth sitting with is not what they missed. The question is what we are missing right now, today. In the systems we are building with complete confidence. Systems that future generations will look back at with the same mixture of admiration and disbelief that we bring to a rusting iron hull, and the 4,000 people who trusted it with their lives.